In the last lecture, I gave a brief overview of the first, second and third person narrative forms and drew out some broad distinctions between the first and third person forms. In this lecture, I'll look in some detail at the first person narrative form. And the lecture falls into two parts. To begin with, I'll attempt to categorize the different types of first person narrators, and then I'll go on to say something about the power of the first person form. Now, there are a number of different types of first-person narrator, and by far the most common is the first-person narrator as main character, hero or heroine, that is, the protagonist, and this goes right back to the earliest European secular written fictional tradition in the form of the Spanish picaresque, and has continued to be used ever since. You may have read Lazarillo de Tormes. If not, do. So this is the I did this, I did that, I went here, I went there type of first-person narration, and is the most common form. You also have the first-person narrator as secondary character, as observer of the central protagonist, and the most famous example is probably Dr. Watson in the Sherlock Holmes stories. All the stories are told from Watson's point of view. He is the I of the story, but the stories are mostly about the he, Sherlock Holmes. And the fact that Watson is a bumbling idiot and that he doesn't understand Holmes's methods only goes to heighten the powers of the genius detective for the reader. If the narrator had been super clever, we might be less impressed by Holmes. And if the narrator was Holmes himself, we might simply think him an arrogant, boastful prat. Because we see him through the dim-witted Watson's adoring eyes, we can't help but admire Holmes. And incidentally, the elementary "my dear Watson" is another of those catchphrases that have mysteriously caught on, despite having never existed in the original text. Then we have stories with multiple first-person narrators, such as Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury and Akutagawa's Inner Grove, which was of course the source of the Kurosawa film Rashomon. Now, it's probably worth saying a little more about the Akutagawa story. What you have in Inner Grove is one single incident recounted from a number of different and contradictory perspectives. The basic facts, insofar as we can get at them, are that a husband and wife, when travelling, were attacked by a robber. The wife was raped, the husband murdered. But each section of the story has a different narrator. The woodcutter who found the husband's body, a Buddhist priest, the policeman who arrested the robber, the mother of the wife, the robber himself, the wife who was raped, and finally, the ghost of the dead husband. And of course, the tales are quite contradictory. It's only by putting the various voices together that you can make sense of the story. But even at the end, contradictions and uncertainty remain. It's interesting to note that in terms of the film, Kurosawa said that the actors were constantly coming to him and asking what was the truth of the incident, and he always replied that they'd missed the point. Kurosawa wanted to explore multiple realities, as he thought that human beings were quite incapable of telling the truth, always embellishing elements in the retelling to save face or to portray themselves in a particular and usually favourable way. Now, we do this all the time, don't we? Think of the way your boyfriend recounts his transgressions, how he minimises the extent of the infidelity, the role he played in initiating it. It wasn't me, it was the alcohol. I'll never do it again, I promise. I love only you. Blah, blah, blah. And this does not apply only to men. I always thought it peculiar that men are almost universally condemned for infidelity, and supposedly even the statistics bear this out. And yet, just exactly who are they being unfaithful with? So do not women park their misdemeanours in a place they won't be found and keep them hidden from others and from themselves? Well, forgive me if I'm just doing a sexist generalisation. The point is, don't we all minimize our own misconduct, our own dirty deeds? I do. Trivializing them, recasting my role in the retelling in a more favourable light, psychologically repressing or skirting over the morally embarrassing details, making excuses for my own excesses, ignoring or minimizing the devastating consequences of my behaviour on others, etc., etc., etc. It even works on a commercial and political level. Take arms sales, for example. Now, this must be one of the most vile and disgusting forms of business practice that exists, more appalling in its effects than the drug trade, human trafficking, child prostitution, and international terrorism combined, in terms of its contribution to human misery. The selling of guns and bombs and aeroplanes deliberately designed to kill people as efficiently as possible, to blow the limbs off children, to murder and maim, to poison, gas, and annihilate whole populations. But human beings indulge in this trade. How do they rationalise it? Right from the shop floor to the top? Well, at the bottom, it's, I'm just doing a job, making parts. It's not the weapon that kills, it's the person that pulls the trigger. A gun's just a tool. If I didn't do it, someone else would. And higher up the chain, you get, this is a legal business. Products are exported under a strict licensing regime. It's a regulated trade. If we didn't sell the missiles, the Russians would. It's to control the bad guys.
Not only were these dictators repressing their people, ruling by control, not by consent, plundering the national wealth and denying people their basic rights and freedoms, they were funding terrorism overseas as well.
And isn't it a marvellous inspiration to hear the words of our ex-Prime Minister trumpeting the glories of the democratic Arab Spring and rightly scourging Arab dictators for the human rights abuses? And it's interesting to note that within 6 weeks of this speech, Cameron spent 3 days of his precious time as Prime Minister with a bevy of arms traders doing billions of pounds worth of arms deals. Guess where? And guess with whom? Yep, that's right, you guessed it. In the Middle East, with those wonderful, freedom-loving democracies, the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. Dictatorships, we might add, who have been ruthlessly repressing the Arab Spring in their own countries. And if you think these days are past, anyhow, these are the kind of states giant UK corporations engage the British Prime Minister to secure billion-pound arms deals with. How do the human beings involved in this trade justify that? Well, and this is the somewhat tenuous link of this digression to narrative form, they tell themselves subjective first-person narratives in which the point of view is skewed in their favour. And I guess the ones at the top just put the money in their pockets. Surely there's a satirical story in that, though I don't suppose anyone would believe it. So, back from subjective rationalizations to multiple points of view, from one type of horror story to another, if you like. There are a number of Gothic novels with multiple first-person narrators. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is an obvious example, in which, framed within a series of letters, 2 first-person narratives are told. One subjectivizing the experience and agonies of Frankenstein, the scientist and creator, and then a tale within a tale, that of the creature himself. Bram Stoker's Dracula is in fact an epistolary novel. Epistolary from Greek epistoli, simply meaning letter. So it's a series of journal entries, diaries, letters, memoranda, even newspaper cuttings. But most of all, Dracula is in the form of Harker's or Mina's or Dr. Seward's journal entries. So we get a variety of different first-person narratives. And from Gothic to science fiction. Perhaps you know Flowers for Algernon, the 60s story by the science fiction writer Daniel Keyes. But whilst there is only one character narrating, I'd be tempted to categorise this as a multiple first-person narrative because the protagonist changes so much that there are at least two different voices of narrator. And there is the rather unusual form of the plural first-person narrator. A we rather than an I is telling the story. This is rare but does exist in stories by Faulkner and in Eugenides' The Virgin Suicides, and there's also an interesting short story by Theodore Sturgeon written in the plural first person called Crate. Just recently I was reading the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a fabricated anti-Semitic text that formed the basis of Umberto Eco's novel The Prague Cemetery. And the protocols are written in the first person plural. And this kind of makes sense, given that it was supposed to be a conspiracy by a group of people who wanted to take over the world. So I can see how the first person plural form might be useful in paranoid science fiction, for example, if you were interested in the voice of the terrifying dominant other, who is not one person, but an elite group, or a person so assured of his own power and role that he no longer subjectivizes himself as an I, but as a we, like our Queen, for instance, a megalomaniac. Now, don't get me wrong, far be it from me to slander our lovely Queen as a megalomaniac. I'm not concerned with the individual here, but rather the institutional convention of the monarch speaking as a we, i.e., the institution of monarchy is a form of absurdly inflated megalomania. It's interesting what Žižek, my favourite Slovenian philosopher, says about the movie The King's Speech, the 2010 Ton Hooper film. For Žižek interprets the king's stutter as an understandable reaction of an individual human being to the ridiculous role he's been thrust into. Of course the heir to the throne knows he's not really special, not really a king, just a person like anybody else, that the fact people treat him differently is ridiculous, that there's nothing inherent in him to make him a king, etc., etc. And the stutter is a hysterical but understandable reaction of the individual to this predicament. It's a kind of eminently admirable psychological refusal to take up such a ridiculous role. And then, at the end of the film, it turns out the speech therapist has not been so much coaching the king's voice as coaching him to take up his symbolic role. The therapist sits in the king's chair, the throne, and the king tells him to get out of my chair. And the therapist, of course, asks the question, why? Why shouldn't he sit in the chair? It's a purely arbitrary role. It could be anybody. And then the heir to the throne comes out with what Žižek calls the whole stupidity. The power of the monarch, lineage, divine right, all the ridiculous mythology that belongs to an age long gone. And the therapist gets out of the chair. The heir to the throne, the man who rejected the role via his stutter, has now fully taken on board his symbolic role as king, and having stepped into the fantasy, has killed off the only decent part of his individual human soul. Right, so to come back from thrones and royal we's to the first person plural form, which is, of course, an unusual, rare, but nevertheless existing form suitable for conspiracy theories and megalomaniacs. Does anyone remember when Margaret Thatcher began to refer to herself as we? And hence it offers interesting possibilities for the writer. Now, I mention all these forms, first-person narrator as protagonist, first-person narrator as observer, multiple first-person narrators, plural first-person narrators, and mention some fictional instances, partly so as you can go away and read what others have done, but partly to stimulate your imagination into thinking about the potentialities of the written form and the different choices you can make. But why is the first-person form, particularly the first-person narrator as protagonist, as main character, so common? Why should we use it as writers, given all its restrictions and limitations when compared with the third-person form? I think because for the reader, the first person has the power of a direct voice talking to us. It seems natural, personal, honest. It's used in those fictional narratives known as autobiographies that we believe to be true. And it seems to have a special relationship to the real and to real life, to the lived experience. At its most intense, the reader becomes the priest in the confessional, listening to the inner secrets of the writer's soul. And I don't think in the history of fiction that there's a more powerful use of the first-person form, of the I as author, narrator, protagonist, of the direct voice spilling out the contents of its soul, than that of the realist, hyper-realist, surrealist, modernist mystic Henry Miller. Let's just listen to a 5-minute extract from Henry Miller's Tropic of Cancer, one of the great novels of the last century, to get a feel for the powerfully personal, intimate, confessional nature of the first-person voice when used by one of the great writers of the 20th century. I've accompanied the excerpt with some pictures of Henry, his wife June, his mistress and niece, and of others by the photographer Georges Brassai of Paris in the 1930s. Here Henry is haunted by the fictional Mona, whom we assume is, at least in part, his real wife June, now back in America. Henry Miller's Tropic of Cancer. Excerpt on Mona. Now and then, it's true, I did think of Mona, not as of a person in a definite aura of time and space, but separately, detached, as though she had blown up into a great cloud-like form that blotted out the past. I couldn't allow myself to think about her very long. If I had, I would have jumped off the bridge. It's strange. I had become so reconciled to this life without her, and yet if I thought about her only for a minute, it was enough to pierce the bone and marrow of my contentment and shove me back again into the agonizing gutter of my wretched past. For 7 years I went about, day and night, with only one thing on my mind, her. Whether a Christian so faithful to his God as I was to her, we would all be Jesus Christ today. Day and night I thought of her, even when I was deceiving her. And now, sometimes, in the very midst of things, sometimes when I feel that I am absolutely free of it all, suddenly, in rounding a corner perhaps, there will bob up a little square, a few trees and a bench, a deserted spot where we stood and had it out, where we drove each other crazy with bitter, jealous scenes. When I realize that she's gone, perhaps gone forever, a great void opens up and I feel that I'm falling into deep black space. And this is worse than tears, deeper than regret or pain or sorrow. It is the abyss into which Satan was plunged. There is no climbing back, no ray of light, no sound of human voice or human touch of hand. How many thousand times, in walking through the streets at night, have I wondered if the day would ever come again when she would be at my side. All those yearning looks I bestowed on the buildings and statues, I'd looked at them so hungrily, so desperately, that by now my thoughts must have become a part of the very buildings and statues. They must be saturated with my anguish. I could not help but reflect also that when we had walked side by side through these mournful, dingy streets, now so saturated with my dream and longing, she had observed nothing, felt nothing. They were like any other streets to her, a little more sordid perhaps, and that is all. She wouldn't remember that at a certain corner I had stopped to pick up her hairpin, or that when I bent down to tie her laces, I remarked the spot on which her foot had rested, and that it would remain there forever, even after the cathedrals had been demolished and the whole Latin civilization wiped out forever and ever. My world of human beings had perished. I was utterly alone in the world, and for friends I had the streets, and the streets spoke to me in that sad, bitter language, compounded of human misery, yearning, regret, failure, wasted effort. Passing under the viaduct along the Rue Broca, one night after I had been informed that Mona was ill and starving, I suddenly recalled that it was here, in the squalor and gloom of this sunken street, terrorized perhaps by a premonition of the future, that Mona clung to me and with a quivering voice begged me to promise that I would never leave her, never, no matter what happened. And only a few days later, I stood on the platform of the Gare Saint-Lazare, and I watched the train pull out, the train that was bearing her away. She was leaning out of the window, just as she had leaned out of the window when I left her in New York, and there was that same sad, inscrutable smile on her face, that last-minute look which is intended to convey so much, but which is only a mask that is twisted by a vacant smile. Only a few days before, she had clung to me desperately, and then something happened, something which is not even clear to me now, and of her own volition, she boarded the train, and she was looking at me again with that sad, enigmatic smile which baffles me, which is unjust, unnatural, which I distrust with all my soul. And now it is I, standing in the shadow of the viaduct, who reach out for her, who cling to her desperately, and there is that same inexplicable smile on my lips, the mask that I have clamped down over my grief. I can stand here and smile vacantly, and no matter how fervid my prayers, no matter how desperate my longing, there is an ocean between us. There she will stay and starve, and here I shall walk from one street to the next, the hot tears scalding my face. Wow, Henry Miller, a subjective first-person best, bearing the entrails of his desperate soul. And if you're not moved by that, then you're made of sterner stuff than I. Now, by way of contrast, and I'll make a point about this shortly, let's just switch from the sublimely disturbing to the creepily disturbing and listen to an extract from a novel called The End of Alice, a story about a little girl murdered by a paedophile, the tale narrated by the paedophile himself.
Mine is the speech, the rhythm and rhyme of an old and peculiar man who has been locked away for too long, punished for pursuing a taste of his own. Alice, I hand your name gently, suggesting that if you hold it carefully as I do, pressed close to the heart, you might at the end of this understand how confusing the beating of two such similar hearts can be, and how one finally had to stop. And let it be said that I have the utmost admiration and respect for the young women to be discussed, for young women in general. The younger the better. I am the first pervert, the first lover of youth. I am honoured, I am touched. When I think no one is looking, I touch myself.
Disgusting, eh? The paedophile narrating the account of his relationship with the little girl, Alice, he had murdered. Nasty. But you may, from the picture of an actual convicted paedophile, that is a real life equivalent of the narrator, have got the wrong idea of A.M. Holmes, as the author, Amy Holmes, actually looks like this. The real Amy Holmes. So remember what I said about the first person offering the possibility of alternative eyes, personas writers adopt, other subjectivities which are clearly not the author's. So we've mentioned the paedophile narrator in Amy Holmes's novel, but another interesting one comes to mind in a novel I read recently, and that is the anti-Semitic, racist narrator of most, but not all parts of Umberto Eco's The Prague Cemetery. So get hold of these novels and take a look for yourselves.